Well, here we are at Theo Fantastique, and from time to time we have these conversations with authors and even once in a while film producers. But at this point, my guest is Ryan G. Duns, and I'm going to read Ryan's bio here. He is an associate professor of theology at Marquette University. He is a Jesuit priest, as you could probably tell those who are watching rather than listening, with the clerical collar there. And today we're going to be discussing his new book, Theology of Horror, The Hidden Depths of Popular Films. Ryan, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, John, for having me. I'm really excited to be with you tonight.
Yeah, I don't know how your book came across my social media feed. I subscribe to a lot of academic publishers and do a lot in religion and pop culture, and I'm just pleased that it popped up. And of course, the title caught my eye immediately, given its similarity to a volume that I co-edited a while back with Brandon Graphius. But let me
Yes.
begin. I know the answer to this, I think, but for this is an obvious question to me, but it won't be to some listeners and viewers. And that is, why does a Christian, especially someone who is a Jesuit priest, not only enjoy horror, apparently, but find it a good object for academic reflection and even for theologizing?
I think that's the best question. I often get people who ask, they think that I'm trying to turn their children enrolled in my course into axe murderers or sociopaths. And there is a suspicion of horror. And
Yes.
what I think part of it is I'm an Irish Catholic guy. I think I have an ornery streak, and I am drawn to the subversive and the transgressive. One of the observations, and I make it a little bit in the book, but I'm more and more convinced of it, is if we look at the most popular genre of film among young adults, say 16, 18 to 28 and 30, it tends to be horror and comedy. Well, I don't have a great sense of humor, so I gravitate toward horror. But what interests me there as a discipline as a genre, you have overwhelmingly popular films that are supernatural in orientation. But then you correlate that insight with this is the very demographic that is most likely to disaffiliate from or not be affiliated at all with a religious tradition. And I see that in the students I teach semester after semester. So it seemed to me appropriate to try to take something that they are already interested in, conversant with, artifacts of of popular culture that I can hook their imaginations with, and then try to use that as the doorway, unorthodox though it may be, to introduce them to what I think in the end comes out to some pretty orthodox and traditional teachings of the Christian tradition.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation that you make. I remember I went to Protestant seminary 2005 to 2007, and I remember taking a course on new religious movements, and I was struck by the instructor who mentioned how pagans are often drawn to fantasy and different groups enjoy science fiction. It dawned on me that Christians are missing an opportunity to engage certain genres because people are doing their own theology all of the time. Only instead of drawing upon sacred texts, many times they're drawing upon the artifacts of pop culture. Would you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. The number of times people will quote some received religious truth, and I do that with air quotes for your listeners, not the viewers, that clearly is not true. That is just made up, some apocryphal tradition that has accreted around religion. So they either make things up or they inherit uncritically from a cinematic tradition or a folklore tradition, and they conflate that with theological teaching. So I find, again, if I can kind of co-opt some of the loci for where they would go to receive these teachings, as it were, maybe I could reframe it for them and give a different twist to what they think they know.
Hmm. Well, there are a lot of reasons, of course, why people are drawn to horror. Some people just like the fear aspect of it. My wife loves roller coasters. I hate them, but I love horror films. Some people want a visceral reaction. They're drawn to the gore. That's never been my thing, although I think sometimes gore can serve the story, the narrative very well, as in John Carpenter's The Thing. But
Sure.
you quote Victoria Nelson and argue that it has a deeper function. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that when we look at like Nelson's work, you have the insight that our sense of the transcendent has been displaced and relocated, it not in celestial heights, not in cathedrals, but in the dark corners of the room, under the bed, maybe if we're lucky in a dungeon where we at least expect to find something monstrous. But there is nevertheless a deep fascination and I think an inclination toward probing the mysterious elements of the world in which we live. And where in other eras we did that with, say, religious worship, liturgical practices, today, where we have a detachment from that, that impulse remains. And so people are drawn to look for it elsewhere. And I think in many cases, Hollywood does a really good job of finding a profound and, let's be honest, profitable way of drawing uh, seekers into into that mystery and titillating them, terrifying them, but getting them to wrestle with that Nicene insight of we believe in things visible and invisible, the seen and the unseen. And I think that's a perennial draw for people.
Mhm. In your book, I haven't seen a whole lot of folks do this. You distinguish between a definition of terror and horror. For
Mm.
people who may not understand that distinction, why it's significant, can you go into some of that?
Sure, so I was building off of Anne Radcliffe on this. So terror for Radcliffe is atmospheric. It's the ethos. If I think, for my money, the most terrifying movie right now is Hereditary. I think Hereditary does a great job. You're just building this terribly tense atmosphere of foreboding. You know something's wrong. And yes, there are some good jump scares and things that shock you, but overall, it's an atmosphere of dread. Horror, on the other hand, is more intentional. It's horror at, and it's directed toward the fearsome, horrifying entity, malevolent creature, supernatural being, what have you. So horror is much more, I find, much more directed. It's being horrified at something, where terror, it sort of like grabs you by the shoulders and just icy vice grips you into submission. Horror is a much more visceral punch in the gut, or it attempts to be.
And you're not arguing that these don't overlap and one may not lead
Oh,
to
yeah.
the other.
Not at all. In fact, I think many films do a good job many good horror films are capable of establishing that ethos of terror and play off of it and intertwine the two. Um, I just watched Terrifier 3, and I would say it's definitely horror, but I didn't find it terrifying. I did not find, because I kind of knew what I was getting into. Whereas Jaws does have an atmosphere of terror because it's what's unseen and lurking. There's the music contributes to that. Hereditary creates that atmosphere of terror, and then has the things that, whether it's the shark in Jaws or it's you know the head in the driving scene in Hereditary. I think that's horrifying. I hate to. I don't like being that guy with spoilers, but
Right.
you know. So I think a really well crafted. You don't need lots of blood, guts, and gore to have a great horror movie that affects you because it's terrifying. But if you don't have Terrifier, I think you really do need to be over the top at times with
Hmm.
the gods.
When I first started Theophantastique, there wasn't that much by way of academic exploration of horror, and I kind of found a niche and was interviewing authors and scholars who are willing to come on and talk about it. Now you see that quite a bit. It's very popular. However, not for theologians. Now, in our book on theology and horror, we did something different. We were looking at different aspects in pop culture where you could pick theology out of it. You're actually constructing theology through engagement with horror. Why do you think theologians should take this seriously as a venue for that kind of activity?
The philosopher Arthur Murdoch says the philosopher goes where the honey is. And I think we have that's where if that's where people's imaginations are, then there's something at work in that. And I think it is to our detriment to not raise the questions, to not turn over to turn over those rocks and to see what's underneath them. There's that uh, author Asa Rahan, I think I do quote the Asa or Asia, who said, who was indignant over Midnight Mass and said, this is ridiculous because uh, horror is the last preserve for atheists and skeptics. And I thought, no, 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 no. Like these are movies that raise really important, really interesting questions. And I would say to my theological colleagues, maybe we need to get our, noses out of the tabernacle and start working our way into where, into the alleyways and byways where people are, where they're going. Nothing against the tabernacle, obviously, I believe, deeply, committedly, but that's not where our young people are. And I can craft a theology, or I tried to craft a pathway through theological exploration that led students along a horrifying journey, but one that I think that they're more willing to take and be transformed as they undertake it.
I'm glad to hear you mention Midnight Mass. I really enjoyed that. So much for theological reflection there, whether you're Catholic or not. I mean, questions of
I
eternal life and life in the blood and all of this, it was just fascinating. So if people haven't seen it, I would encourage them to seek that out.
completely.
It was just excellent. Let me get your speculation on why you think theologians and maybe just practical theologians, everyday Christians are not using horror. Do you think it's because it's considered too dark? Because maybe we have a sanitized theology, a sanitized faith that tends to not see the darker elements even in our own religious tradition. And therefore, when we look at horror that focuses and brings that right in your face, it's just it doesn't fit. It's considered unclean and you just shouldn't be engaging it. Is anything to something like that?
I am when I you know I I've often said when Jesus came and preached, he did not say, "Blessed are the poor in theory." This wasn't a thought experiment. Like, oh, they're good, like over there. Jesus entered into the chaos of our world, or as I try to say in the book, Jesus enters the horror story made by sin and disrupts it and gives us and shows us a new way forward and reconfigures space and time itself through his teachings and through miracles that show us another way of life is possible. I I think we expend an awful lot of energy trying to turn a blind eye to the realities of history. And Karl Marx was onto something when he's saying that religion is the opiate of the masses. It's not that religion in itself is bad, but it can be used to inoculate ourselves against the real horrors of history. And I think a theologian has to have the courage to open his or her eyes and encourage others to open their eyes and to do what can be done to get people to look at the horror story of history. Look, I don't want to meet Candyman when I go to brush my teeth tonight. And I'm not going to play with the Ouija board and invite Pazuzu into the house. And I really am not looking to convert the soul of Leatherface anytime soon. But those are temporary horrors compared to what I can see on the streets or what I can turn on the news. And if I'm offended by what I see in a movie and not offended what I see in real life, I have to reevaluate my priorities and really think, has the gospel taken root in my heart in a way that has opened my eyes to the horror story that I'm living in? And So what I'm in a way trying to do is get readers to look at horror not only as a lens, but as a mirror that reflects back and gets them to do some critical examinations of the way we are willing and often unwilling or unwitting participants in something pretty awful.
Yeah, and hopefully to kind of pick up on that, we can also look and see some of what we might call the darkness within our own religious tradition. Today, I don't know if you're familiar with the scholar Joe Laycock. He wrote his recent book. He co-authored The Exorcist Effect, looking at the film The Exorcist and the interplay between that film and popular culture and how there's this loop that goes around in culture. He posted something today in social media. I can't remember what he was taking issue with, but there was a conservative Christian group who was opposing it because it was something Halloween related, because it was dark and focused on death, unlike the Christian faith. And I thought, wait a minute. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I appreciate the emphasis on the crucifix in the Catholic tradition, which we don't have in the Protestant traditions, the empty cross. We tend to lose sight of the horror that was the crucifixion and the reality of death and its defeat at the heart of our tradition. So are we not, don't we also have a blind spot in our own tradition many times?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is, when you look at, I'm a product of Catholic education. I love our saints. And you have Saint Lucy with her eyeballs and Saint Lawrence. I'm done on this side. Turn me over as he's being roasted alive. Uh, One of Mary's, the Blessed Mother's names, Mother of Sorrows. We have within the tradition, I think, all the resources that allow us to take a real critical look, not at our world and ourselves, and we don't often do that. And I think we do ourselves a great disservice spiritually and historically when we don't take seriously uh, what we have done as believers, practitioners of the faith, and what our traditions have perpetrated against others, what we have failed to do, where we have failed to live up to that gospel call to love neighbor and love God. Uh, so there's always a call to a radical form of justice, not just of being nice or doing something good, but really taking seriously what the incarnation means. The word becomes flesh, not to tear it apart, not to savage it, but to redeem us and make us whole. But that also means we have to do a real critical self-examination, take that seriously.
Yeah, as a quick aside, I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Guillermo del Toro, one of my
Yeah.
favorite directors, um, raised by a stern Catholic grandmother. And he oscillates between atheism and agnosticism. But what's fascinating, if you look at his commentary and his films, I have a blog post where I say you could take the man out of Catholicism, but you can't take the Catholicism out of the man. It's fascinating how he continually revisits these themes, even as a professing agnostic or atheist. So um, just another example of the kinds of richness that we can engage in there.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at Terrifier 3, De Leon is that the director's last name? Raised Catholic, kind of an agnostic now, but in this third installment, the imagery is everywhere. Very deeply Catholic, the Blessed Sacrament, Mary, uh, crown of thorns, salvation. These are all the questions he's raising. And it's funny, or Mike Flanagan from Midnight Mass, who says, I was an altar boy and now is an atheist. And he says it's because of the science being the thing that drove him a wedge between him and his faith. I wish I could talk to him about that. That would be a fun conversation to have. Uh, but yeah, I mean, but their imaginations are suffused with it, and that Catholic way of seeing and perceiving certainly comes through cinematically for them.
Yeah, it's fascinating. At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned the rise of the nuns, not the NUNS, but the NONES, those people who say that they don't affiliate or identify with any organized religious tradition. Some of them are atheists and agnostics, but the vast majority are spiritual but not religious, pursuing this kind of eclectic, individualized spiritual quest that many times is syncretistic. Given that that is a huge audience now out there, How do you see horror as serving as a way to open up a sense of the divine and a renewed theological imagination? We're not just talking to Christians that we're hoping to woo back to church. It's a different culture now.
It is a different culture. And I think part of this, and that's why I start somewhat with metaphysical reflection. Can we start to raise the questions of what it means to exist, the limits of human cognition, what we can know, and what's at the outer rim? You have Lovecraft, who will talk about, that scratching at the rim of the known universe of something trying to break in. And I think helping students to view horror as raising deep, existentially important questions is one strategy. You can go in and if I walked into my upper level elective and brandished a crucifix at them, some of them would know what it means, and others would just yawn. But if you sort of go, I'm a student of Karl Rahner. If I can get students to start asking the big questions, following the why, thinking through the limits of what we can know, and does the visible and the seen exhaust the realm of reality? And then to think, what is the mysterious realm that transcends our grasp? That starts to, you can start to ask questions. Do you recognize yourself in this? And make the film and make the course self-implicating. So it's not a transactional course, not a and that's the hope of the book, at least. It's not read this and know more stuff. You have to know more stuff. But do you see yourself in this? Have I engaged you on an intellectual journey as a companion thinker along with you, as the guide in a sense, to help you think through these films in a way that transforms the way you see the world around you? That is, we gather what I call the metaphysical and theological fragments, that with each fragment gathered, you say, oh, my world picture is changing. I'm seeing things under a new light. And so I try to make it an engaging exploration that pushes us to see things anew.
Mm-hmm. Do you guide your students through a historical comparison of the way horror has developed? So you go from the post World War II, where the culture is processing the horrors of the war, and then you get into the 1950s, and it's still very much a Christian kind of consciousness that infuses horror there. But then when you get into the 60s and 70s, it takes on more of a nihilistic pessimistic kind of tone. And today it's kind of a mixed bag depending upon where the culture is at. How do students react to their cultural moment in horror?
Well, this has been the funny thing. Like, what I have asked, I've taught the theology of horror twice. I'll teach it again this spring. There are times I have students who they celebrate Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger. Others have never heard of, never seen. For them, for some of them, it's Scream, the most self-aware, self-conscious horror movie. And for them, they think that's a classic, which breaks my heart. So I try again. I try to use the films, and I will admit I'm not a scholar in that of social history of the films
Mhm,
so
mhm.
much as I am. Let me use them as what I call the infernal icon, as opening a doorway to have the reflection. But it does often come up, like how 80s slashers, the 90s self-consciousness of horror, the Saw films of the early aughts, and how does that capture the zeitgeist of the moment or challenge the zeitgeist of the moment?
Well,
But
I've got
that's
one.
much more loose.
Yeah, yeah. I've got one more question. Then, if there's anything you would like to get out, I'll give you a shot here. But just so people know the structure of your book, you've got three sections. The first looks at the dark transcendent. The second looks, as you mentioned, at infernal icons. And the third explores dark graces. Might be a tough question. Out of all of that, what is a favorite example that stands out for you, perhaps above all others in all of the material that you covered? As a theologian and a fan.
So maybe so people would expect me to say The Exorcist, and I joke that I may or may not have become a Jesuit because I may or may not have dreamed of being an exorcist at some point in my life. And Jesuits are pretty cool. They were my teachers. I really really appreciate The Black Phone. Derrickson's Black Phone, written by Joseph Hill, son of Stephen King. And the reason I do is like to when I watch it with people, I use the line, all I want you to say is, God writes straight with crooked lines. And then at the end of the movie to repeat that line. And the film takes on a different hue. And what you start to see is, in a bizarre way, providence at work. This dark grace, and that is not, it does not excuse the grabber of his crimes or absolve him of his evil. But it's interesting to see the way that the events that happened before can be connected in and through the life of one who hears the call
Mm.
and is responsive to that call. So I find that just very, and probably I didn't bring it out as much as I could have on the question of vocation. Who are we called to be, and how are we participants in writing straight with crooked lines? But it takes seriously the fallenness of the world, the dark, senseless force. We really never get the whole psychopathology of the grabber and why he does what he does. There's suggestions, of course, but that film, I find it just opens up a lot of conversation, and it teaches us a great deal about, as I do push in the text, about prayer, that we pray as we are. And in this case, you have Finney's sister who is praying in pretty explicit terms for what she really wants and confronts her own limitations. And in her own way, it opens up to the divine to manifest itself on its terms rather than the terms she has set for it, which is a lesson most of us need to learn time and time again.
Mm. Well, this is the point of the conversation where I say, is there anything that you wish I would have asked or you'd like folks to know about your book?
To be honest, I really wrote the book to be read and enjoyed. I think it should be read in community with other people. It's not, I would hope people say like, oh, well, I'm going to revisit some of my old favorite films when I teach the class in the spring. So starting in January, it meets on Tuesdays from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. And part of the conceit of the course is that they will watch the film together, and then I let them out because I want them to go to have a meal together. So at 6 o'clock, it's about dinner time for most students. They can go and eat and talk about it, try to do the theology together, and then read about one feeble-minded person's attempt to put a framing on it, and then to come back the following week and have a discussion. So I am not Moses off the mount, or Freddy Krueger, the crypt keeper out of the vault with all the answers. But I just thought it would be I figured I had a semester off to write, so I would write a book that I thought would be fun to write and might be fun to read. And if it helps people ask big questions, think about the way they think, and think about the way they see the world, then I was successful in doing it. So I hope it's something that people enjoy. I wish I could and maybe I will do another one if people like this one. Uh, there's so many good films out there. I picked 15 that I thought were fun. I could pick 45 more, and it would be a delight.
Well, here's to hoping you have a follow-up volume. It was great. And, for individuals or classroom use or what have you. And again, the title is Theology of Horror, The Hidden Depths of Popular Films. And folks can look in the notes for the post that goes with this video, and they can click it and purchase a copy. And again, the guest has been Ryan Duns of Marquette University. Ryan, thanks so much.
John, thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
It has been great.